do you find in Yemeni coffee that, in your experience hitherto, you haven't experienced elsewhere in the specialty coffee world?
It's hard to give a very precise answer because, you know, experiencing so many coffees, it's at a certain stage, you know, you'll have descriptors that kind of match a broad range of coffees. But I think that what is outstanding about Yemeni is not rather a certain flavor profile, but their complexities in the high quality coffees. You can find a lot of descriptors in such coffees, and especially the acidity. It's stellar sometimes, you know, if you have the high-end ones. It is, you can think about a Sauvignon Blanc or something like that. It's really complex, and it's really complementing the cup, the way it sustains the sweetness in there. So this is what I really appreciate about Yemen. Except that obviously depends on the region that you're cupping, but a lot of berries and gooseberries in there, and honey. That's impressive how much honey you can have in Yemeni, or a honeycomb, if you want, as a flavor. Yeah, but generally, as I said, the complexity that you get in Yemeni, it's absolutely outstanding. Very few coffees, very few origins in the world would match that complexity that they can bring on the table, and especially that perfect balance in between flavor, aftertaste, and acidity. It's really outstanding. Again, obviously, as I said, in the high-end ones. Yeah.
That's very interesting. And I think complexity is what brings us back again and again, because you can have a standout coffee that knocks you between the eyes, but it doesn't refresh the palate, and it doesn't challenge the mind to reflect about what's going on there. John, you've had a lot of experience consulting and advising across the Red Sea. You know Ethiopia well. We ourselves understand a little bit about Ethiopian coffee, and I know that it has a place in the market in China and Korea and Japan. From your experience, let's scope in on the Red Sea for a moment in trying to address this question. What would you say was distinctive in your experience in the Yemeni cup to what you can find at the top end in Ethiopia, whether it's Geisha Village, Sidamo, Yogashefi? In broad terms, what is it that you would struggle to find if you went to Ethiopia?
It's a really interesting question, Matt. I think to some degree, if you kind of look at the land races of the two countries, there's always going to be a separation from there, where you've got kind of some distinct sort of genetic base in terms of the plant material. I think that's sort of going back. We can maybe chat about this later on in terms of the morphology of the seed that you're looking at in terms of the grading. So I think sort of underlying everything, kind of the raw material, there's a distinct difference there. To also then climate is very, very different as well. And I think that the first time I went to Ethiopia was in the year 2000. I remember, because it was still in the 1990s in Ethiopia, because they have a different calendar. That was sort of quite striking for me visiting there. And the other thing that was very, very striking was the geography was very, very different as well. It was kind of much greener. I remember I went to Yogashefi on my first trip, and it had hit something like 4 degrees centigrade that night. And so it was very cold, and it was green, and there were pineapples growing around, and it was different from my preconceptions of what Ethiopia would be as a place. And I think that the climate and the terroir of Yemen, plus the genetic material, is really important in forming these unique different flavor profiles, because over hundreds of years, the plants that are grown in Yemen have had to adapt and evolve to cope with this different climatic environment, and they behave in a very different way. And I'm sure that sort of that must be an underlying factor in why the flavor profiles are different. And then going into other things that we know can influence flavor profile. You know, sort of acidity will increase as a general rule of thumb. The higher you go up in altitude. You know, there are some very high altitude coffees here, and I think what's always very striking for me with the Yemeni coffees is you forget that you're cooking naturals, because the levels of acidity, as Alan said, they're really complex acidity profiles. They're high in intensity, but never too intense, because they're complex and they're structured, and they add a spine to the coffees to allow these other kind of unique flavors to come out as well. But to counteract that level of acidity, there's a level of sweetness that you often don't find in other countries as well. And even taking some coffees from Ethiopia and some from Yemen, if you cook them side by side, to some degree, people might say, "Oh, these are very similar flavor profiles, because there's lots of strawberries and kind of dried fruit and florals going on." But if you kind of look at them side by side in terms of the nature of the profiles, often it can be very surprising how very different they are. That sort of there is a very distinct sort of difference in terms of the structural acidity and sweetness of the Yemeni coffee from again very, very high sweet and complex coffees from Ethiopia. So, and I think that they stand out differently because of that. Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you very much for that, John. Marty, you've sniffed the earth, as it were. You've been to Yemen. Yemen's going through trials and tribulations just at the moment, so it's difficult to reach. Are we talking about Yemeni coffee as a time capsule, in the sense that it's been remote, it's not had a lot of commercial traction for a very long time, farmers have not had education and access, they haven't traveled, they've not brought in new varietals, it's been a process of them, by trial and error, finding what works best for them on their particular terrace with their soil morphology, on the pitch. What is it, do you think, that's happened in Yemen over these years? There's a lot of work being doing on genetics and trying to identify mother species, and there's a lot of work that I know Aaron Davis is doing at the moment in this field, not specifically with Yemen, but more generally. We'd all be very, very interested to hear what you found on the ground when you've been there, Marty.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what you explained is exactly right. It is kind of been locked in time. Nothing's really changed in a really long time, and that, in some ways, that's a challenge to be overcome. But in many ways, that's also, I think, a strong advantage, that you're dealing with these really old varietals that have really adapted well to where they are. I don't think if you brought a bunch of geishas to Yemen and planted them, that they would necessarily enjoy their life there very well. The likelihood of them even surviving, much less producing high quality coffee, would be probably quite low. And then doing a lot of the strange things that work other places may or may not work there. It's such a different climate, such a different topography, such a different everything, that there's just nowhere else. There's nowhere else like it. And you see that reflected in the cup. You see that reflected in the amount of both fruity and spiciness, that you have fruity like Ethiopia and spicy like a Sumatra somehow in the same coffee, which is not a normal human experience. I mean, you can't find that kind of thing anywhere else. And so I think that though there's all these challenges with geopolitical challenges, with infrastructure and shipping and all these things, that somehow people have been committed enough to this craft to keep it going all these years, and the degree of local knowledge that's really quite correct is really shocking. 3 of the different people that worked on different projects there have come back and talked to me and said, we came with all of this data-driven research that was totally wrong in Yemen. And then we talked to these illiterate farmers who had been farming for 8 generations, and they knew what to do when it came to the farming side. Processing, there's a tremendous amount of new information, understanding about microorganisms and about fermentation that can be probably infused into the process there that will be beneficial. But so many of the farming practices in Yemen are different than the right answer in other countries, but it's working there. And in fact, the right answer sometimes doesn't work there. So I think that when we approach Yemen, we have to come with anywhere, but especially in a place like Yemen, with a real teachable and humble heart to say, there's probably things that have worked great in Ethiopia that will be complete failures here. And there's probably things that, maybe have worked in Guatemala that actually would work here, or what have you, and regardless of the place. And trying to do experiments in a humble way that really takes into account the degree of local knowledge. I've never seen any farmers in the world other than Yemen that can judge density based on holding a handful of coffee. To say, oh, this coffee is more dense than that one by holding it. I can't do it. I've never seen anyone else that can do it. And I thought, this is just Arab trickery. I am sure this is wrong. But then we went and took the coffees and put them in a density meter, and yeah, they were right. They said these are more dense, these are less dense, and they were correct. There's just so many different areas of local knowledge that exist there that we need to capture and actually share with other parts of the coffee producing world, and have more back and forth, more flow of information. And I think hopefully, as not only COVID works itself out, but some of the geopolitical unrest works itself out, hopefully that can happen more and more. More producers from other places can come to Yemen to learn, more Yemenis can go to other producing countries to learn, and overall we can kind of increase the larger pool of knowledge.
Yeah, John, well, thank you for that, Marty. And we're going to scope in now on the regions a little bit. But before I get to that, just to corroborate what you were saying, that it isn't smoke and mirrors. I come from an agricultural background myself, not coffee. But I know that experienced grain merchants can simply take a sample of wheat in their hand and within 0.5% tell you what the moisture is and the protein level, because they can feel how hard it is and they can feel the weight of the grain. So that type of intimacy, which, in the modern scientific empirical world we can perhaps suggest is unreliable, is all that people have had to measure as a yardstick for quality down the years. And it's kind of worked. And I think you're correct to say, if we approach with a degree of humility and soft hands, the collaboration is so much the richer, both sides learning from the other as we travel down the road together. We're bringing coffee from 4 distinct regions, from Haraz, Al-Khaimah, Ib, and Is. Now, when you look at the geography, some are more verdant, green. Others, like Al-Khaimah, are incredibly arid, high altitude, steep pitch, 2,300, 400 meters, very, very limited, thin soils, impoverished, naturally fertilized with manure, organics, and a limited capture of surface water. And of course, coffee is fighting with other crops for what is available water, and we know that Cut has taken a great deal of the available attention and nutrients and water away from coffee over the last century. And that's something that Chiba, obviously, we're anxious to address going forward, to bring a cash crop with an external dollar value, rather than with cut, which is traded domestically and has no international role in commerce for Yemen. So it may be a little bit difficult for you guys to call it, but let's look at Alzheimer for a moment. We've had some very interesting scores from you guys out of there this year, particularly, and because Alan and John were closely calibrated and did the same exercise, Marty, last year for us. Again, there were some standout Alzheimer coffees.